The autumn arrived not as a season, but as a creditor, stripping the last warmth from the Callaway house in a matter of days, pulling colour from the garden, pulling laughter from the rooms, pulling even the pretense of abundance from the dining table, until what remained was a cold, quiet house, full of women who had learned to speak around the truth rather than through it. The roses along the east wall had gone to brown. The drawing-room curtains, once a deep burgundy, had faded to the colour of old rust, and no one had thought to replace them, or perhaps no one had the money, which amounted to the same silence. Elara Callaway sat near the window in that room on the morning everything changed, mending a hem no one would thank her for mending, in a dress the colour of ash, and she was thinking about nothing at all, which was the private luxury of women who had long since stopped expecting anything from the day. She was 26. She had the kind of face that was called sensible in company and plain when company departed. Her eyes were the grey of quiet water, and her hair was the brown of turned earth, and she kept both tidy and both unremarked upon, which suited her perfectly well. She had learned, somewhere between the age of 16 and the age of reason, that the best armour was the appearance of contentment. She wore it as naturally as she wore the ash-coloured dress. The sound of her sister's laughter came through the ceiling from the floor above, bright and cascading, the way Vivian's laughter always arrived, announced, performed, and demanding of an audience. Vivian Callaway was 22 and beautiful in the way that stopped conversations. She had their late father's colouring and their mother's gift for standing in light so that it fell on her to best effect. She owned 6 gowns to Elara's, too, and she wore them with the casual sovereignty of a woman who had never once doubted that she was the point of any room she entered. Their mother appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room. She was a woman whose worry had calcified into something harder over the years, and she wore it in the set of her jaw and the quick, assessing movement of her eyes. She looked at Elara as she often did, through her rather than at her, and said, without preamble, "There is a car coming up the drive, a long black car, 3 more behind it." Elara set down the hem. She looked out the window. The procession that moved up the gravel drive of the Callaway house was not 3 cars. It was 10. 10 long, black, mirror-polished vehicles moving in formation, spaced with the precise regularity of ceremony. And at their head, a flag she recognized without wanting to recognize, because it was the kind of flag that appeared in newspapers and on the walls of civic buildings and on the television in the moments between ordinary life and the news that changed things, the kind of flag that meant that the world beyond one's own small life had suddenly become interested in one's doorstep. "That is the royal standard," Elara said very quietly. Her mother stared at the cars. The silence in the drawing-room had a particular quality to it. Then their mother's voice came, hushed and startled, and already beginning to reconstruct itself into something more composed, something that would, by the time she opened the front door, resemble equanimity. "Send for Vivian," she said. "Go quickly. And change your dress." She was still wearing the ash-coloured dress when the knock came, because she had gone to the window again instead of to her wardrobe, watching the cars arrange themselves along the drive with the practiced precision of a procession that had done this many times before, in front of many doors, to many people who were not ready. She had stood there at the window, watching a footman open the lead car's door, thinking in a distant, observational way about the months and years that had brought the Callaway family to this particular morning. Her father had been a man of grand gestures and small accountings, and the distance between what he had promised and what he had left behind had proven, over the 11 years since his death, to be considerable. The house was theirs. The name was theirs. The rest was increasingly theoretical. A man in a dark coat emerged from the lead car. Then 2 more. Then last, the one they were flanking. Tall and still in the cold autumn air, wearing no insignia that she could see except the bearing he could not remove, even if he had wished to, the bearing of a man who had never in his life walked into a room and wondered whether he had the right to be there. Prince Caspian of Dunmore was 31 years old and had been described in the 3 newspapers that arrived at the Callaway house as austere, enigmatic, and unwilling. He had never been described as warm. He stood in the drive of her falling-down house, looking at the peeling paint on the window frames with an expression that gave nothing away. And she looked at him from behind the curtain with the steady attention of a woman who had learned to observe the world from its edges. And she thought, "He is not cold. He is contained. There is a difference." The thought surprised her. She let the curtain fall and went downstairs to greet the company she had not been asked to greet. Vivienne descended the main staircase 12 minutes after the royal party entered the Callaway drawing room, and those 12 minutes had been spent in productive transformation. She wore the green silk, the best green silk, the one kept for evenings that mattered, and mornings that might unexpectedly matter more, and her hair was dressed as though she had been expecting company of exactly this consequence all morning. She was radiant. She knew it, and the knowledge sat on her like a second gown, luminous and effortless. The prince rose, as courtesy demanded, when Vivienne entered, and his expression did not change. And that did not seem to Vivienne like information, because expressions rarely changed in her presence from anything other than admiration. And absence of admiration registered to her as a kind of neutral starting point, a before state that would resolve itself in due time. The prince's private secretary, a careful man named Harrowfield, explained the situation in a tone that was diplomatic to the point of being nearly drained of all content. There was a matter of an old agreement between the Callaway family and the House of Dunmore, a debt arrangement from Ilara's grandfather's time, land and title and capital, bound up in a contract that had seemed, at the time of signing, entirely theoretical and had become, in the long and indifferent march of decades, entirely real. The House of Dunmore was prepared to settle the debt entirely and to secure the Callaway family's financial future with a settlement that would, Harrowfield said, with the precision of a man measuring every word, ensure the family's comfort for the remainder of the century. In exchange, a member of the Callaway family would enter into a formal arrangement with the Crown. The room understood what kind of arrangement was being discussed. Their mother's breath came out slowly. She sat very straight. Vivienne sat with her hands in her lap and her shoulders drawn back in the particular attitude of a woman composing an expression of gracious surprise. Ilara sat to the left of the fire, near the window, in her ash-coloured dress, which she had not changed because there had not been time, and she had a notebook open on her knee that she had brought downstairs before the meeting, intending to use it to record the names of the household accounts she needed to review before the end of the month. She had not made any notes. She was watching the prince's private secretary explain the arrangement, but she was also, with the peripheral awareness of the habitual observer, watching the prince himself, who was in turn watching her. He was not watching Vivienne. He was watching the notebook on Ilara's knee, and then, when she lifted her eyes and found his gaze, he did not redirect it. He looked at her directly, with the steady, specific attention of a man who looks at things in order to understand them, not in order to acquire them. She held his gaze for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and she did not look away, because she had nothing to hide, and had never seen the point of performing modesty she did not feel. Then Harrowfield's voice curved into something that required a response, and Vivienne said something gracious about being honoured, and the room moved forward, and the moment closed over itself like water. The prince stood to take his leave. He crossed the drawing-room, he stopped at the door, and he turned, and he looked not at Vivienne, who was rising with her particular practised grace to see him out, but past her, at the woman in the ash-coloured dress by the window, who had already returned to looking at the blank page of her notebook, as though she might begin her accounting after all. he said quietly, so that only Harrowfield heard. Tomorrow. Miss Ilara Callaway. Arrange it. The drawing room did not hear him. Ilara did not hear him. Vivian heard him, and for one moment she stood very still beside the doorway, and the green silk made no sound at all, and her face composed itself with the careful artistry of a woman who has learned, long before any formal instruction, that what one shows the world is the only currency that cannot be repossessed. What followed was not a scene of confrontation so much as a scene of realignment, the way ice cracks and reorganizes, coldly and without ceremony, into a new configuration that accommodates what was never going to hold. Their mother called Ilara into the small sitting room used for private conversations, and Vivian stood in the doorway because she had been asked to stay out and had chosen not to. The prince's intention had been communicated, Harrowfield having returned alone the following morning with a sealed letter that addressed itself with careful formality to Miss Ilara Callaway. Their mother held the letter as though she was not certain whether to open it or burn it. Outside the window, the autumn held its cold, stripped course. "There is clearly a mistake," Vivian said. It was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes, and she said it the way one states a mild meteorological fact, pleasant, certain, and free of drama. She turned it over and examined it for no more than a moment, finding it sound. "He met me for all of 4 minutes. He didn't speak to me. He means a different Miss Callaway. A cousin, perhaps. A family of similar name." "He said your name," their mother said to Ilara, and the way she said it was not warm. It was the voice she used for accounts that didn't balance, the voice she brought to problems that were nobody's fault but that were, nonetheless, someone's problem. "He said it specifically. He asked for you." Ilara took the letter. She read it. It was formal and comprehensive, and considerate in a way she had not expected, laying out the terms of the arrangement plainly, listing the securities it provided, and stating in its final paragraph, in language that was precise and unambiguous and had evidently been composed with great care, that the decision was entirely her own to make, and that no secondary pressure would be brought to bear on any member of her family in the event of a refusal, and that no explanation for a refusal would be required or requested. She read that paragraph twice. She sat with the letter for a long moment in the small, cold sitting room in her ash-colored dress, while her mother watched her and Vivienne stood in the doorway in the green silk, and she thought about being seen. She thought about the way his gaze had moved from the notebook to her face, unhurried and specific, and she thought about what it felt like to be looked at as though you were the point of the looking, which was something she had not often had occasion to feel. She thought about 26 years of being the useful one, the quiet one, the one who arranged the flowers and managed the accounts and sat to the left of the fire in a dress the color of nothing much, and she thought, plainly and without self-pity, that she had become very good at being invisible and that she was not entirely certain she wished to continue. She folded the letter. She looked at her mother and at Vivienne in the doorway, and she said, without inflection, the words that rearranged the architecture of everything, "I will accept." Vivienne's composure held. It held beautifully and without visible effort. Only the line of her shoulders very briefly shifted and then resolved, and then she smiled, and the smile was faultless, and she said, "Well, I suppose that is that." She left the doorway. Her footsteps were even and unhurried on the stairs. Ilara stood in the small sitting room with her folded letter and her mother's silence pressing against her from all sides, and she understood, without requiring it to be said aloud, that she had not been expected to say yes, and that her saying yes had produced a rearrangement nobody in this house was quite ready for, least of all herself. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what they wanted. She offered none. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The Dunmore Palace sat in the northern quarter of the capital, like a man who had decided, several centuries ago, to stop apologizing for his size. It was not beautiful in the way that postcards described beauty. It was large and ancient, and arranged with the kind of geometric severity that suggested it had been designed by someone who considered sentiment a structural liability. The grounds were vast and cold and formal, and the trees along the east approach stood at such perfect intervals that they felt less like trees and more like a sentence in a language Elara did not yet speak. She arrived in the fourth of the 10 black cars, which seemed, she thought, an appropriate position. Not the first, not the last. Harrowfield met her at the main entrance and introduced her to Mrs. Aldine, the head housekeeper, a woman of roughly 60, whose face was an arrangement of controlled assessments, each one filed and returned to as needed without any of the sentiment that assessments could, in less disciplined people, accumulate over time. Mrs. Aldine looked at Elara. She looked at her dress, which was grey, a finer grey than the one she had worn at home, but grey nonetheless. She looked at the single case Elara had brought, which was clean and well kept, and contained exactly what was necessary and no more. She said, "You will find the palace cold. Most people do at first. I grew up in a house with 4 broken radiators." Elara said, "I am accustomed to cold." Mrs. Aldine's expression did not change, but something behind it did, very slightly, the way a key makes almost no noise in a well-oiled lock, a small and barely audible turning. "I will show you to your rooms," she said. The rooms were beautiful in the austere, impersonal way of royal residences, all silk wall coverings and tall windows and furniture that had been chosen for the communication of rank rather than the comfort of bodies. There were fresh flowers on the side table, white and very stiff. There were dust covers still on the chairs in the adjacent sitting room, as though no one had decided yet whether the room was going to be used, or perhaps as though everyone had quietly decided that it wasn't. Elara looked at the dust covers. She thought about the drawing-room curtains at home, rusted and unreplaced. She thought, "I have experience with rooms that haven't decided whether they're going to be used." She pulled the nearest dust cover off herself, folded it neatly, and set it on the floor. The young maid standing in the doorway, who had been hovering with the careful readiness of a person waiting to receive instructions, stared. Her name, Elara would learn, was Petra, and she was 18 and curious in the way of very young people who haven't yet learned that curiosity is considered a liability in formal households. "Would you like?" Petra said. "I'd like to know where the kitchens are," Elara said, "and the garden, if there is one, and the name of the man who keeps the garden, if there is one of those too." Petra blinked. "There is a garden?" she said after a moment. "It's not no one really uses it. His Royal Highness doesn't tend to go there." "That's all right," Elara said. "I do." She met the prince formally for the first time in the palace library 3 days after her arrival, which told her something about the pace of things in this world. That 3 days could pass before a man and his arranged bride occupied the same room. He was reading when she entered, or he had been reading. The book was open in his hand still, but his attention had moved. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them manufactured an expression for the other's benefit. "Miss Callaway," he said. "Your Highness," she said. A pause opened between them that he seemed disinclined to fill with anything convenient, and she found she was not disinclined either. They held the quiet between them like 2 people who have both, separately, learned that silence need not be filled simply because it exists. "You have been removing dust covers," he said at last. "4 of them," she said. "The chairs in the east sitting room wanted to breathe." Something moved across his face, not a smile. The almost of one, the ghost of the country a smile might be found in if one travelled far enough in the right direction. He said, "Mrs. Aldine finds the pace of change alarming." "Mrs. Aldine," Elara said, found the pace of change alarming when she herself arrived here 30 years ago. She told me so this morning over the household ledgers, which she brought to me herself, unprompted. We have that in common." The almost smile moved again. He set the book down. He looked at her with that unhurried, specific attention, as though she were something he was genuinely trying to understand and was in no hurry to finish understanding. "Why did you accept?" he said. He said it the way one asks a question one has been holding for several days, carefully, without weight on any particular word, as though the question itself had been waiting to be asked, and he had finally found the right room for it. She thought about what to say, and she chose the plain thing, because the plain thing was always the truest, and because she suspected he was a man who could recognize the difference between the plain thing and its dressed-up counterpart. "Because you asked for me," she said, "not for the one who was expected. You asked for me specifically. That happens, in my experience, almost never." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a very honest answer." "I am a very honest person," she said. "It has not always worked to my advantage." The almost smile became something infinitesimally closer to the real thing, and then, as she had begun to expect, the world closed over it like water, and he nodded once and said he hoped she would be comfortable, and he left the library, and she sat in one of the newly uncovered chairs and watched the light move on the bookshelves and thought about almost smiles for a long time after he had gone. The weeks moved with the deliberate pace of a household learning a new grammar. Elara did not perform warmth. She simply was warm, and that was a different thing entirely. And the palace, which had long experience of performance, seemed uncertain what to do with the genuine article. She learned the names of every member of the household staff within her first week, which struck Mrs. Aldine as either an extraordinary social gift or a profound misunderstanding of hierarchy. She sat with Petra in the mornings and listened to what Petra reported about the palace's daily rhythms with the attentive patience of a woman storing useful information for later use. She had the absurdly long dining table, a monument of dark mahogany that could seat 30, and which she and the prince occupied from opposite ends, like opposing generals in a campaign neither of them had declared, shortened by 9 feet. When the tablemaster arrived with his tools and his air of baffled professional pride, she thanked him by name and asked after his daughter's examination results, because Petra had mentioned, in passing, that the man had a daughter studying medicine in the city, and this small detail had lodged in Elara's memory the way small details always did, as something that mattered to someone, and therefore ought to matter. The man stood for a moment in silence with his hat in his hands and then said, "She passed, Ma'am. Full marks." "Of course she did," Elara said. "What a clever family you have." He left the dining room walking differently than he had entered it. She found the garden on her 4th day and understood immediately why no one used it. It had been a rose garden once, and the bones of it were still there, the stone paths, the iron trellis work, the remnants of planting beds that had once been magnificent. But the roses had been left too long, and they had gone to thicket, all stem and thorn with nothing flourishing, the growth dense and defensive and turned inward. She asked about the gardener and was told his name was Marsh, a man of few words who managed the formal front grounds and had not touched the east garden in 6 years, since, she was told with a careful pause, since the last time anyone had asked him to. She went to find Marsh and found him in the tool shed, repairing a pair of shears with the focused economy of a man who respected objects that did their job faithfully and believed that things ought to be maintained. She introduced herself. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes took stock of her, with the same unhurried assessment that she had long ago learned was the reliable version of opinion. He said simply, "The East Garden." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then he said, "It'll take until spring to clear properly." "I know," she said. "We'll start now anyway." He almost smiled, though he had less practice at it even than the prince. He found a second pair of shears and handed them to her, and they worked until the light went. And when she came inside that evening, her hands were marked with small cuts from the thorns, and she was warmer than she had been since arriving, from the work and the cold air and the particular satisfaction of useful effort. It was the prince who came to find her that evening, which she had not expected. He appeared at the garden gate just as the cold was becoming serious, and he stood there in his coat with his hands in his pockets, looking at the cleared ground and the cleared paths and the beginning of an order where there had been only thicket. He did not speak for a long moment. "My mother planted this garden," he said. His voice was even. She had come to understand that he kept his voice even the way she kept her face still, not from absence of feeling, but from long practice of protecting what feeling there was from the elements. "I know," she said gently. "Petra told me." He nodded. He looked at the cleared stone path, pale in the last of the light. "Thank you," he said. It was the most unguarded thing he had said to her. She recognized it as such, and she did not make much of it, because she understood, instinctively, that what unguarded things needed most was not to be treated as momentous. She had excellent taste, Elara said. "These are old roses, heritage varieties. They'll be spectacular in June, if we're patient." He looked at her for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. "I have learned," he said quietly, "to be very patient." The world didn't close over that moment immediately. It held briefly in the cold air between them, suspended, before the garden gate swung on its hinge in a gust of wind, and the spell released, and he said good evening, and she said good evening, and they walked back into the palace separately, as they always did, through their different doors. She did not think about him on the way upstairs. She thought about the roses. She did not know when the arrangement had ceased to feel like an arrangement. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way seasons change, not in a single transformation but in the accumulation of small particular moments, until one morning you look at the garden and realize the garden is entirely different from the garden it was in October. He began to appear in the library when she was there. He did not always speak. He read, and she read, and the room held them both with a kind of quiet sufficiency she had not known a room could have, a sense of 2 separate lives occupying the same space without requiring that space to perform anything for them. He began to come to dinner without requiring the cathedral distance of 30 people's chairs. He sat 3 chairs from her end of the shortened table, and they spoke about small things, the progress of the roses, a book she had recommended, a letter she had been composing to the charitable organization that managed the city's winter larder, which he had not known existed until she mentioned it, and had then looked briefly startled, the way a man looks when he realizes a whole dimension of the world has been running without his notice, and he is not certain how he feels about that. She learned him by increments. She learned that he slept badly and worked instead, and that the work was relentless and heavy, not because he chose to make it so, but because the weight of governance is not a manageable thing, does not reduce itself to reasonable hours, and never had. She learned that there was a wing of the palace that remained locked, that it had been locked for 4 years, and that no one mentioned it, not Harrowfield, not Mrs. Aldine, not Petra, who mentioned almost everything, because the palace staff had long since understood that this was not a subject that invited conversation. She learned that his almost smile was most likely to appear when she said something plain and true and unembroidered, and she had begun, she realized with a private sense of something warm and quiet and faintly alarming, to value its arrival more than she thought she ought to for the terms of an arrangement. One evening, late, he found her in the east sitting-room writing letters by candlelight, because the power to that corridor had been intermittent for 2 days, and she had not yet reached the right person to authorize the repair. He looked at the candle and looked at her and said, "You should have told someone." "I told Harrowfield," she said. "He is very busy." "He is," the prince said. "But your comfort is not a small matter." He said it simply, without decoration, but it landed somewhere in her chest with a weight disproportionate to its plainness, because no one had said that to her before, not in those exact words, not in any approximating words, and she looked at the candle flame, and not at him, because she had no expression prepared for this particular kind of being seen. "Caspian," she said. It was the first time she had said his name. She had not planned it. The word arrived on its own, drawn out by something she could not quite account for, and it sat in the candle-lit room between them with the weight of something that had been waiting. He was very still. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. "Elara," he said. He said it the way one says a thing one has been wanting to say for some time, with the careful deliberateness of something held and now, at last, released. Then he sat in the chair across from hers, and the candle between them made the shadows warm, and he began, slowly, without being asked, to speak about the locked wing. His name had been Edmund, a younger brother, twin-hearted and reckless in the way of second sons who feel free of consequence, and he had died 4 years ago in a way that wasn't violent and not sudden, but slow and drawn out and therefore somehow worse, an illness that gave them months to argue with it and still lost. The locked wing had been his. The palace had sealed it at the prince's instruction in the week after Edmund's death, and he had not instructed it opened since, because he was not certain what he would find there, and he was not certain he was ready. And then the years had continued in their way, and certainty had not arrived, and the wing had remained locked until it had become less a grief, and more a fact of the palace's architecture, like the cold in the north corridor or the particular creak of the library floor, something that was simply there and around which everything else had learned to navigate. He spoke for a long time. He spoke without elaborate language, plainly and precisely, the way a man speaks when he is not accustomed to speaking about a thing, and is therefore using only the most necessary words because the unnecessary ones would cost too much. He spoke about Edmund's laugh, and the dog Edmund had kept, and the way Edmund had read 3 books at once, rotating between them with a cheerful disregard for narrative coherence that had baffled their tutors and charmed everyone else. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without hurry, without offering anything he had not invited. When he finished, the candle had burned down considerably, and the room was very quiet. "I am sorry," she said. Not elaborately. Just those 2 words, which can mean everything or nothing depending entirely on whether they are said plainly and meant, and she meant them in the full and unqualified way of a person who has also known what it is to lose the shape that a person leaves in a house. He looked at the candle. "You would have liked him," he said. "He would have been helpless against your roses." Something in his voice, just at its edge, suggested something other than grief, the faintest beginning of what might someday be memory without pure sorrow at its center. And she thought, this is what time does, when it is given something to work against. She did not say so. She said, "Tell me something he loved, and I'll plant it in the spring." He was quiet for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. "Lavender," he said. "He kept it in his rooms. It drove the housekeeper mad." "Lavender it is, then," she said. He looked at her then, fully, and what she saw in his face was something that had not been there in the library, or in the garden, or at the shortened dinner table, something unguarded and present and quiet. The look of a man who has said a true thing to someone and found, for the first time, that the true thing was received without casualty. And she understood, without wanting to make too much of it, that something had shifted in the long, slow alchemy of these months, something neither of them had been moving toward deliberately, and both of them had arrived at nonetheless. She went to bed that night, feeling lighter than she had in a very long time, and that was when, 3 days later, the letter arrived from Vivian. The letter was social, on its surface. Vivian had come to the capital for the season, which was her habit, and had found herself within the circles that surrounded the palace, which was not her habit, and had required a degree of effort that she did not mention, but that Alara could read precisely between the careful lines. Vivian had made friends, she wrote, charming friends, and she named them by social position rather than by character, which told Alara everything she needed to know about the quality of the friendship. Among these friends, she noted, in a subordinate clause structured like an afterthought, but functioning as nothing of the kind, was a Lord Penwick, a young man of decent family and uncertain means, who had, Vivian wrote, a great talent for conversation and a great fondness for the racing season. Alara read the letter twice and put it away and went to help Marsh with the rose beds, because the ground was softening at last, and there were preparations to be made, and because she had learned that useful work was the best remedy for the particular chill of premonition. The chill was not misplaced. What happened next happened quickly, which is often the way with things that have been building slowly. She was in the palace gallery one afternoon, looking at a portrait of Edmund she had found by accident, a young man painted in summer light holding a dog and laughing at something outside the frame, when a footman appeared to tell her that there was a notable gathering that evening among the city's first families, described as an informal gathering, which was the society word for a gathering at which all the formal rules still applied, and were in fact applied more rigorously, precisely because no one was acknowledging them. The prince would attend, as he always did. She would accompany him, as she had done, quietly and without particular notice, on the 4 previous occasions of this kind, moving through those rooms in her good grey dress, and returning home with the knowledge that she had been present at something without having been part of it. What neither of them had been told, what Harrowfield had not seen fit to include in the evening's briefing, was that Vivian would be there, and that she had not come alone, and that Lord Penwick, whose debts were not merely uncertain, but catastrophic, and whose fondness for conversation included a particular facility for the strategic placement of rumour in the rooms most likely to carry it, had been very busy in the weeks since Vivian's letter had been written. The gathering was held in the old Meridian house, all high ceilings and chandelier light, and the particular species of laughter that has no warmth in it. Alara wore a gown that had been sent to her the week before, a commission from the palace's household, and it was the colour of the sky at the last moment before full dark, a deep and luminous twilight blue that she would never have selected for herself, and that she stood in now with the private, wondering sensation of someone who has been seen in a way she did not expect. She moved through the room as she always moved, deliberately, without rush, noticing things. She noticed Lord Penwick before he noticed her, and she noticed the way he was speaking and to whom, and she understood, with the quiet certainty of the long-time observer, that something was already in motion and had been for some time. Lord Penwick's story was not elaborate. It did not need to be. He claimed to have been present at a private dinner 3 years past, at which Ilara's name and a man's name, chosen with deliberate care to be exactly the kind of name that would occasion maximum social damage, had been linked in a way that society found both scandalous and plausible, because the social machinery of scandal requires only that the story be interesting rather than true. He presented it with the cheerful authority of a man who has rehearsed something until it has acquired the texture of memory. He told it first to 3 people, and from 3 it became 7, and from 7 it became the room, because stories of this particular type do not walk through gatherings, they run. She was told about it not by the prince, who was across the room with a group of foreign dignitaries, and not by Harrowfield, who had not yet heard it himself, but by Lady Rossmore, a woman of 73 with the sharp eyes of someone who has outlived the need for social cushioning. Lady Rossmore appeared at Alara's elbow, looked at her with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who has seen a very great deal of human nature in her 7 decades, and said very quietly, "Young Penwick is telling a story about you this evening. It is a fabrication. It is also gaining traction. I thought you would prefer to hear it from someone who considers you worth the warning." Alara looked at her. "Thank you, Lady Rossmore," she said. Lady Rossmore studied her face with the close attention of a valuer examining an item of uncertain provenance. "You're not going to faint?" she said. "No," Alara said. "Are you going to cry?" "Not here," Alara said. "Good," said Lady Rossmore, and something in her sharp face settled into a satisfaction she did not disguise. "You'll do." She moved away, back into the room, with the serene momentum of a woman who has done the thing she came to do. Alara remained where she was, in her twilight blue gown, and she looked across the chandelier-bright room, and she found Vivian, who was near the window with a glass in her hand and an expression of elaborately constructed social neutrality, and their eyes met, and something passed between them that was not quite sorrow and not quite accusation, something more complicated than either, the wordless accounting of sisters who know each other's worst capacities and choose, most of the time, not to invoke them, and who are now standing at the precise moment where one of them has done otherwise. Alara looked away first. She looked for the prince. She found him, and found that he had already found her, that his gaze had already crossed the room and settled on her with an attention that was different from the library and different from the garden. Something sharper, something more awake and decided. The look of a man who has understood that something important is happening and has finished deciding how to respond. He moved. He crossed the room the way he crossed all rooms, without hurry, without theatre, but with the unmistakable authority of a man who has decided on a direction and sees no reason to accommodate the obstacles between himself and it. The crowd parted. It could not do otherwise. He walked past Vivienne, who was near the window, and past the group surrounding Lord Penwick, and Penwick saw him coming and stopped speaking mid-sentence, and the silence that followed the stopped sentence spread outward from that point, like a stone dropped in still water, reaching every corner of the room before the prince had crossed even half of it. He stopped in the centre of the gathered company. He looked at Alara, only at her, and he said, in a voice that required no raising to fill the room entirely and reach every person in it, "There is a story being told in this room this evening. I know what it claims, I know where it came from, and I know that it is a lie." The room did not breathe. He looked at Penwick. He said, still at the same measured, carrying pitch, "I am also aware of the debts you carry, Penwick, and of the party who settled the most pressing of them in exchange for tonight's performance. I will be providing the relevant documentation to the appropriate parties before the weekends." Penwick's face moved through several colours in quick succession. He said nothing, which was, by some distance, the most dignified thing he had managed all evening. The prince turned back to Alara. He took 2 steps, and then 2 more, and he was close enough that she could see quite clearly the absence of ice in his expression. The thing she had suspected was under it for all these months now, fully present and unguarded, and making no effort to conceal itself. He said, "I chose you. From the beginning. I chose you not because of an arrangement, not because of a debt or a contract or a letter Harrowfield prepared. I chose you because you sat in your drawing room with a notebook on your knee, and looked at me as though I were simply a person whose thinking you might find interesting. I chose you because you remove dust covers with your own hands, and learn the names of every person in a house, and plant lavender in a garden for a brother you never met. I chose you because you tell the truth plainly, and you expect nothing, and you give everything without requiring that anyone notice the giving. I have watched you take a cold house and make it the only home I have lived in as an adult, and I am not." He stopped. He looked at her, in her twilight blue gown, in the middle of the chandelier-bright room, with the whole assembled scrutiny of the city's finest families around them. Something in him was very still and very open. "I am not able to continue being careful," he said. It was the plainest thing she had ever heard from a royal mouth. She looked at him, this man with his winter-cold eyes and his locked-wing grief and his almost smile, and she thought about the rose garden and the lavender and the candle burning down and his name said for the first time in candlelight. She thought about the ash-coloured dress and the drawing-room in the falling-down house, and 26 years of being the useful one, the quiet one, the one the world moved past on its way to where it was going. She had thought once that she was invisible. She understood now that she had simply been waiting for someone who knew how to look. She said very simply, without adornment, "Then stop being careful, Caspian." And the almost smile completed itself. He smiled, and it changed his entire face. And Lady Rossmore, watching from across the room with a glass she had not touched, nodded once, with the deep satisfaction of a woman whose judgment of people has once again proven precisely accurate, and said to no one in particular, "There it is." Vivian left the gathering shortly after, quietly, with the contained step of a woman who has understood that a chapter has closed and is already composing, in the private country of herself, the first lines of whatever comes next. Elara did not watch her go. Her attention had been given entirely over to where it was most needed, and it did not occur to her to reclaim it. What became of Lord Penwick was brief and unspectacular. The documentation reached the appropriate parties 3 days later, as promised. He removed himself from the capital before the week was out, and went to live on a smaller estate in a quieter county where the winters were long and the society was thin. It was reported in later years that he had taken up gardening with unexpected dedication, which Elara, when she heard it, thought was the most fitting conclusion the story could have found. Vivian did not vanish. She wrote some weeks later a letter that was not an apology, and not an apology, a letter that circled the thing it meant and came close and then retreated, which was, Elara reflected, the most honest Vivian had been with her in a very long time. Elara wrote back plainly and warmly, because she had enough now, more than enough, enough that generosity cost her nothing. They would not be close, she and her sister, not in the way of women who have never stood on opposite sides of a bright line. But they would be in correspondence, and over the slow years they would find, in that correspondence, something quieter and more durable than what they had been before. The locked wing of the palace was opened in February, on a grey and quiet afternoon when the light came in at a low winter angle and made everything inside look gilded and ancient. The prince opened it himself, and she walked with him through the rooms, and they were full of Edmund's things, a young man's life preserved in objects as faithfully as amber preserves what it finds. The racing prince, the books with notes in the margins in a restless, slanting hand, the photograph of the dog, and yes, in a blue ceramic pot on the windowsill, dried to a ghost of itself but unmistakably present, the lavender. They stood in that room for a long time. He did not speak, and she did not speak, and the silence between them was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something full and held, and finally, at last, in the right company, set down. 1 year later, the East Garden bloomed. The heritage roses came in waves, first the pale pinks, then the deep crimsons, then the whites that opened at dusk and filled the evening air with something both delicate and insistent, and among them, in the beds along the stone path, the lavender grew in long rows that swayed in the summer wind and filled the garden with something Marsh said he hadn't smelled in that particular corner of the grounds in the better part of a decade. He said it without looking up from the bed he was tending. She thought it was, from Marsh, high praise. Elara walked the paths in the mornings with their daughter, 4 months old and thoroughly unimpressed by the grandeur of her surroundings, but deeply interested in the roses, reaching toward them with the single-minded purpose of someone who has already identified what she considers most important and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. The prince found them there. He always found them there, mornings, in the garden his mother had planted and his wife had restored, and he had formed the habit now of arriving quietly and standing at the gate for a moment before he was noticed, simply watching, the way a man watches something he values too much to miss even the ordinary moments of. He had a habit, also, of smiling when he found her. A full smile, the real one, the one that had been underneath the ice all along, waiting with the patience of something that knew it would eventually find the right weather. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the roses, and then at their daughter, and then at her, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the warmth of it, and the summer morning held all 3 of them in a light that had been so long and so patiently built that it felt at last like something that had always been meant to be there. The house was no longer cold. The house had not been cold in a long time. She had not been invisible since the day a man had crossed a declining drawing-room, past the woman in the green silk, and found, with the unhurried precision of someone who was paying real attention, exactly the person he had come for. He hadn't been lucky. He had simply been looking in the right direction. And she, who had spent 26 years learning to be unseen, had discovered at last what it felt like to be the only thing in the room that someone was truly and completely looking at. It felt like the first morning of something that was never going to be winter again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.